Hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Walker Art Center. My name is Pablo De Ocampo. I'm the director and curator of Moving Image here. And I'm just going to begin tonight by welcoming you to the Walker Art Center and acknowledging that where we are today, we sit on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary homeland of the Dakota, Minnesota, or in the Dakota language, Minnesota Makoche, which translates to where the waters reflect the sky. Land where the water reflects the sky. We say these things, as you know, at the beginning of many cultural events, not just here at the Walker, but in many other places, to both sort of point to and acknowledge the inhabitants that sort of originally lived in these lands before colonialism and settling of this continent forcibly displaced many of those people. And they, of course, are still vital and important parts of the community here today. We're here tonight to watch a film called Preemptive Listening by Aura Satz. And one of the questions of Aura's films is asking about what sirens are, what they do, how they might function differently. Are they they're both sort of at once sort of alerts, kind of alerting us to danger or disaster, but also in a way calls to action. And I was thinking a little bit as I was getting ready for this evening about these acknowledgments that we make and how they might be considered as alarms of some sort, something that is both pointing to a disaster or pointing to a catastrophe, pointing to something that is happening or has happened, but is also maybe a call to action to think about how you relate to the world and how you relate to those disasters or those catastrophes differently. It's asking you to sort of think about what you do in relationship to those. What else am I saying tonight? This is a program that some of you may have seen a little bit of about 2.5 years ago. For folks who are familiar with some of the Walker programming that we've done recently, we kind of stage up these things called cinema residencies. And so I take some moments at the beginning of some of these programs to talk a little bit about what these are. So Aura's been engaged in like a very loose cinema residency over a long period of time that began in the fall of 2022 with a test screening of a portion of the film that is now complete that we're here to watch today. These cinema residencies, as you know, the Walker is like a big, institution. It's a museum. We don't have like a cottage kind of in the woods where artists kind of go and think about and make work. But I like to think of a cinema as a space of social gathering, of social convening, where artists and audiences come together and think about things. And so the prompt of these kind of programs is to think of the space that we convene in together to look at cinema as a space where artist production, artist thinking, artist ideas happen. And so this is one sort of output of that that is happening. These happen overlapping with each other, and they happen over many times, many time spans. Preemptive Listening is a film that was many, many years in the making with Aura and made in many different small components. It's a film that asks that question about sirens and invites many different collaborators, both orally, people who Aura collaborated with, to create propose different ways that we might hear sirens, as well as many different thinkers, activists, writers who are writing, doing activist work and thinking about what these questions mean in the real world that they're working in today. Other notes that I'm going to give tonight are just a huge thanks to Aura. She's here from London. We're really excited to welcome her here. Aura will be joined on stage after the film with Pooja Rangan, who is joining us from Massachusetts/New York for a little conversation. So sit tight if you want to take part in that afterwards. They'll talk for a little bit of time. We'll have some time for audience questions. A couple of other notes about the film. Sirens. As you imagine, there's going to be some flashing lights. So if that's something that affects you, just be aware that that will happen. Avert your eyes at those times. Sounds can be kind of loud. It's a film that is very demanding of how you listen, and that operates in a few different registers. So both in terms of sirens, in terms of what we're hearing, but there's also many different voices speaking with many different accents. So it's a very demanding space to be in to listen. Just I invite you to lean into that and focus and be with the film in whatever way makes sense to you. And I think that those are my opening remarks for today. The film's about 90 minutes. We'll see you afterwards for a conversation. Thanks very much for coming.
I just want to quickly say two things before we start. One is thank you so much to the Walker and everyone here who supported it in the early stages, and it's quite incredible to bring it back here. And the other thing I wanted to say quickly is that this is the first time I've seen it without captions in a very long time. I think maybe since I premiered it in, last year in February. And then since then I've shown it always with captions, and today mostly my mistake, we didn't. But I just want to point out that there's one bit of spoken word within the music in the chapter on Palestine and Israel. And usually that would be captioned, but if you didn't understand what was being said, it was walls will fall. So I just wanted to highlight that in case you just heard it as voice without understanding what was being said.
First off, Aura, what a stunning film. I mean, it was incredible to see it in this space. I'm so grateful to Pablo for bringing us here and for giving me this opportunity to be in conversation with you again. So Aura and I actually met it was about 10 years ago, when it was at the beginning of a big project for each of the two of us. I don't think we knew what that project was yet for each of us at that time. But for me, it became a book about documentary and listening. And Aura, I think it was right around the time that you were beginning, or you would soon begin, your collaboration with Mazen Kerbaj, who we hear doing a trumpet improvisation over the sound of bombs falling. And we hear Khalid Abdallah speaking in a section that's kind of the pivot of the film and kind of launches us into really the premise of the film as it keeps unfolding. So yeah, I wonder if you would just start us off by saying a little bit about that early collaboration and how these two people, a musician and an actor and an activist, became what you refer to so beautifully as beacon voices. Voices that we all feel within us as we kind of live through what we now know is an emergency that has come to our door, and which others have lived before and tried to tell us off before, while also recognizing something of an opportunity within that moment. And they both speak to it in different ways. So perhaps you could start us there.
Yeah. First of all, I had a little bit of money when I first came up with this project, and I invited several musicians, many of whom I'd already worked with, and then I was kind of looking for musicians that might resonate with the project. And Mazen Kerbaj, who is a Lebanese trumpet improviser, also a graphic artist, I recommend you look him up on Instagram. He had done a piece in 2006, which was a duet to the sound of the bombs of Israel bombing Lebanon in 2006. So I knew, and he went on his balcony and did this piece of improvisation. So I knew he would resonate. So I got in touch and I asked him to compose a new siren sound, and he came up with this incredible trumpet. He has a very particular technique of kind of playing it with a kind of tube attached, and anyway, very sculptural and actually very resonant of the Thunderbolt siren in particular that spins in the film. And then Khalid, I invited him to do a talk at the RCA where I teach, and then over lunch he said, what are you working on? Or we each said, what are you working on? And I said, I'm doing this project on sirens. And he said, I have something I want to share with you. I have an experience. So that's how it came about. Khalid kind of came to me, was kind of gifted to me as something very precious. And then I made that first film. I had maybe 40 minutes of music, but I had a little bit of money to make a film. And I wanted to film Mazen and Khalid together because there was something in Mazen's trumpet that was heralding and summoning. And it wasn't just the siren that is the sound of trauma, it's also the kind of counter siren. And the way Khalid talks about the siren during his involvement in the Arab Spring is very much as the sound that signals, obviously, the emergency that was taking place, but also this friction of a revolutionary movement trying to break through, trying to kind of herald, manifest itself. And so through the conversation with him when he talks about the fork in the road and the sound that obviously is trauma, but is also the sound that helps him find his way. And that is a sound he doesn't want to forget because it is a marker of this future that could have been. That really was the seed that planted the whole idea, which I guess was already there in as much as I was inviting people to reimagine the siren musically through language, through spoken word. But this idea that the siren really points to a future that we set the intention for. It's not just that like the onslaught of catastrophe is upon us, but that actually, if you think of the ambulance, which is maybe the best example of like a good siren in the sense that we understand that siren to be life-affirming, to be at the service of care and safety and future and survival. And most of the sirens, I think, are kind of subsumed into this much more military, oppressive, negative, apocalyptic reading. And I wanted the film to trace this arc that Khalid articulated so beautifully very early on in the project. And I kind of held that, as a beacon, and also filmed it so that his voice is literally the emergency light and the kind of metaphor of the lighthouse, which runs throughout the film, which is a way of seeing the potential catastrophe and averting it like a lighthouse, which is a very different image, I think.
Yeah. You know, I was reading this exchange that you were able to stage between Mazen and Khalid at the Tate. And Mazen said something absolutely heartbreaking, which is that, you know, he's kind of talking about hearing this relentless sound of bombs falling. And this is during the 33-day war in Lebanon. And he talks about how, you know, people kind of continue their lives as these bombs fall. You know, you learn to recognize the sounds, you prepare for them, you carry on, you fold the laundry, you put the kids to bed. And he remembers as a child, you know, living through the civil war in Lebanon. And he says, you know, we children used to play a game where we used to try to guess whether the bombs were on our side or the other side. And this is such a kind of potent expression of one kind of surviving through the impossible, finding room for relationships and play and endurance through it all, but also of the way in which while living under the specter of state violence, what should be unimaginable, what should be catastrophic, begins to kind of take on the thrum of the mundane. And so there's something of that which your film picks up in a very profound way, in the way that you get us to think about how time itself is perceived as compressed in a way that actually really scrambles our perceptual systems. And, you know, one register in which I've thought about that kind of scrambling in my own work, and which I think all of us have experienced, you know, in living through this kind of mediascape that we're inhabiting right now, is this dilemma that no matter how many images we produce to evidence human rights violations that are ongoing, life simply seems to go on, and in fact, the violations seem to continue to mount, perhaps even accelerating with the very pace of the images that we produce to evidence them. And people offer various diagnoses of that. You know, like, oh, we've run out of compassion. We have compassion fatigue. We perhaps it's the problem of the left. We need to come up with new strategies. A.L. Wiseman says, you know, human rights has become a problem not of scarcity, but of managing information abundance. But, you know, you offer something of a different diagnosis in this film, which is you ask us actually to think about that scrambling of our perceptual systems as a result of actually oppressive forces that employ the specter of violence in order to crush dissent. And they do so through the systems of war, through the systems of technology. and through what I think you're connecting as a kind of war and weather continuum in this film. And I wonder if that resonates with you as something that the film is doing.
Yeah, wow, that's such an amazing question, statement, articulation of ideas. Yeah, I mean, I think the project, Pooja has a book forthcoming on listening in documentary called The Documentary Audit. It's much more than that, but I've just tried to summarize it. But I was reading it, reading a draft of it before today, and I was really thinking about the kind of wider issue within this film is a problem of attention, what we pay attention to, how we listen with our ears, but also with our full-bodied senses, and as metaphor as well, how we listen or pay attention. And I think the siren is a very useful trope for us to think through this constant onslaught and bombardment of images, but also of voices calling out for, you know, in my working definition of the siren that I start with, and I think of it as a kind of score logic of the film, which is that the siren is a call to attention. It contains within it an instruction, so it calls to action. And lastly, that it points to the possibility of survival, or it points to the exit route, which I can just about see over there. And so when you think of it in this way, as like so many things that are sirening, as Arturo says, we are in a crisis of both a kind of cacophony of those sounds and those voices and those needs and that polycrisis, those overlapping different forces of the world that are devastating. And maybe we're hearing the instruction, but maybe also the instruction is kind of overwhelming to try and respond to. And there aren't that many exit routes. And I think that's really what you've touched upon and where we are now, where that exit route is narrowing. And for some people, there literally are no safe routes. So I think the siren is a useful kind of paradigm, or I've called it before, a prism and a portal, like to think through some of these ideas, which are, yes, about sirens and the voice of the state and governance, the mouthpiece, but also kind of wider issues around emergency measures used to clamp down on freedoms. The war weather continuum idea actually comes from some of the writing of Brian Masumi, and he's talking specifically actually about, I think the book is called Onto Power, where he talks about preemptive power, and I read it just after I'd come up with my title, and I actually make a differentiation because the way that he talks about preemptive power is this time scrambling that you mentioned, kind of preempting the terrorist attack by attacking first. You know, kind of post 9/11 logics, operative logics. But my use of the word preemptive, I think, is much more aligned with the way that we understand preemptive healthcare or preventive healthcare. And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier around really trying to make or recalibrate this emergency, this crisis of attention towards setting the intention for life. I mean, it's super hard. It's super hard, but that's where I want to be politically, personally, spiritually. And that's where I wanted the film to get to. I couldn't have done it on my own, and I was very grateful, actually, Arturo, when I met Arturo and spoke to him, and you know, he said this beautiful thing of emergence within emergency. It was just the perfect ending, because it is that in this moment of extreme crisis, there is the possibility of breaking through and formulating things differently. So, fingers crossed.
I mean, yeah, I felt so grateful today in particular to be sitting with that reminder. And I think many of us are in this moment right now where, yes, we're in this moment where everything that we took for granted yesterday is crumbling today. But there is really a kind of, it is an opportunity to recalibrate, and for many of us to ask questions about some of the relationships and relational forms that we've kind of organized ourselves around, and to maybe ask if there's a different way of doing things, simply because we can brush away some of the distractions that have kept us from asking those questions for a while. And that can be really powerful. But I want to think about how that really comes to the fore in that beautiful conversation between Asantewa and Nikki, who go back to your observation that preemptive medicine is a kind of antidote and a warding off of the logic of the preemptive strike. And while watching that section this time, I was thinking to myself how the siren, as they're invoking it, and this is the mental health response section of the film, where these two people are articulating a different way of responding to mental health crises that doesn't involve calling the cops, who often do so much more violence and harm in the name of safety, in the name of public safety. But I was listening and thinking, the siren is really a kind of sonic expression of seeing like a cop. It is a kind of activation of a kind of alarm in response to signs of the irregular, which are, often just like extremely ideologically coded in the way of like broken windows policing, in the name of maintaining regularity. But really it's coded with all of the logics that we now know to be the logics of police and the carceral state. And there's something so diffusing about hearing people talk about the very work of having agency over one's own mental health and working to produce that agency for others is in fact the salve. And it could in fact be the salve for so many people, and could in fact produce safety without the need for security. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a real, the Beacon Voices, so there are 5 chapters. And as I said, the first one was Khalid, and that kind of set the tone that I really wanted this, you write about accents. It wasn't so much the accent, but like the tone. I wanted a very particular tone that was not a talking head, not a voice of authority, but that, as with Khalid, who, is the first person that I had this encounter with in this way, that is thinking with us, like listening alongside. Or so none of these people that are featured in the film, I did speak to a lot of people. I have a lot of interviews with people who like are specialists in the field and have written more kind of academic books on emergency or sonic violence, etc. But all of them, I'm kind of asking them to try and think with me, with us, like the music, to try and reimagine safety differently. And some of them, and reimagine emergency and crisis management strategies. And obviously Asantewa and Nikki are within a kind of abolitionist framework, but what they're doing, the work is very literally an alternative emergency service. It's literally, instead of the ambulance that comes with a police car, in fact, it's not mentioned here, but we had a whole conversation about how they wear a particular color, I think it's green. They don't have sirens because they don't want to kind of induce fear in the autistic person or the psychotic person they're coming to rescue. So there's all these different ways in which what they're trying to do, as Asantewa says, her other job is in a hospital, so this question of alarm fatigue is also really interestingly articulated. So many people who work in care in hospitals, it's on a sonic level, it's unbearable. Because everything is beeping and sounding, and but she says instead of escalation, intervention. She says intervention. It's de-escalation. It's calming the situation down so that care and rescue, or whatever you want to call it, can be soothing and can be something that actually recalibrates and calms rather than escalates to the point of split-second violence, potentially. So I really felt that when I was talking with them, and especially towards the end, Nikki says this absolutely beautiful thing, which is it shouldn't be a call to obedience, it should be a call and response, and it should be something that we want to respond to because we feel motivated, because it'll be better for us and we'll be healthy, thriving, free. I mean, it was very emotional. And then Asantewa towards the end was like, yeah, what if it's an opportunity? What if it is this thing that we can think of that signals something totally different? And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us in the moment, say, of the pandemic, in participating in mutual aid networks, I think, people did feel something very different in response to the crisis, because they felt embedded and connected and woven into the fabric of the solution as much as, all the other things that were happening. I mean, maybe I'm nostalgic and idealizing because it was also a terrible time, but
you're thinking about the emergence and not the emergency, which is what your film tells us to do. I want to just pick up on one thing in what you said, which I think has something to do with, it made me think a little bit about your own process of collaboration, and that's something that I think Nikki says at the end, which is that the response, it's a response you hope that you will get because it's a response that actually listens to you, rather than speaking at you or yelling at you. And that was so kind of, it really kind of captured for me something of a different mode of listening, that is a kind of listening for the world we need and things that are actually really needed, rather than within some kind of horizon that we've been told to expect. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about just the kind of audiovisual language of the film and the way that it itself evolves through your collaborations. And I was thinking about this device that you employ in the sequence with Khaled, where the sound of his voice becomes the trigger for a stroboscopic light that is in fact responding to the rhythm of his sounds and turning it into an image for us. And that's something that you do in other ways in the film as well, in that, many of these sirens are located in obscure places, and there is even something a little bit abstract or obscure about the way that the siren sounds. It's a kind of imperative sound, it's an authoritative sound, it's disembodied. And you kind of visualize that for us in a point of view, the point of view of the drone looking from above. So it gives us another way of understanding that the perspective of the siren is aerial, it's often militarized, it's often top down. And then you immerse us at the level of sound in another way of inhabiting sonic space altogether, which is often of deep spaces of sound that we can't really extract ourselves from, or we're often hearing field recordings that are highly textured, voices that feel very close to us, so almost as if our ears become like an organ of touch.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. The drone is an echo of the siren in terms of a technology. I mean, the sirens are connected to technologies of surveillance in as much as they are wired to, whether it's seismic listening to the volcano or the identification of a potential threat, attack. etc. So they are, and just even physically, some of these sirens, especially the ones in the US, they spin and they kind of look like a searchlight. So I had the siren cemetery, I had a emergency light that's also a searchlight that I bought. It's like crazy expensive fancy light. But then I was kind of using it there and thinking of these echoes. But also the drone camera is in part echoing the sound broadcast of the siren, in that it reaches out and it shows the landscape that it is broadcasting to. So often the kind of spiraling is it's thinking around this idea of the sound spread out across the landscape it is embedded within. But at the same time, there's only 2 moments of diegetic sound in the film. One is the church bells in Bethlehem, and the other is the section with Horomo Nahoro playing his beautiful instruments within an environment that, like Matariki says, they are kin. It's a kin-centric environment. So the music, the human, and nature, they're all in a relationship to each other and they're activating each other. But other parts of the sound, I thought, really kind of cut into the image or made you look and listen differently. And when I talk about like which part of the film is the documentary, I think the images document an archive of sirens as they look now, or maybe some obsolete ones. But the sounds they're not speculative as such. They're propositional, they're propositions to listen a certain way. So listen to field recordings of certain insects, which are in themselves, or their absence or their silence, are potential sirens for a certain species. Listening and seeing the image of a wall, the separation wall, and understanding that both sides are hearing this sound, but they are operating in very different regimes and with different positionalities, which means that the siren shapes a listener, or is kind of like something that you write about, this idea that listening in itself is accented. It's not this thing that just takes the signal in a neutral way. That sound, as with Neki and Asantewa, is heard according to where you are physically, geographically, in relation to the broadcasting device's authority. And so there are ways in which I thought of the sound as kind of both drawing you in, but maybe also expelling you to some degree. And also, at the very end, for example, the sound of Evelyn Glennie, wonderful percussionist, it's a very watery sound, and I thought of the sound as putting out the fire. So some of these things where I was really thinking about the relationship between sound and image, sometimes in tension, sometimes in a very tight fit. But actually, for the most part, not too tight a fit, because actually the way we hear the siren, the way we encounter it in the street, is often, because of the Doppler effect, or, wherever you are, you hear it, but you don't know where it's coming from, you don't know what it's for, you don't know if it's a police car or a fire truck or an ambulance. And I wanted people to listen in that way, which is also why the names of the musicians only appear at the end, so that you listen with a kind of openness, hopefully, and a curiosity, and maybe on an affective register, like where it hits you in your body. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you one last thing, and then maybe we can turn to the audience. So if you have things that you'd like to say or things that you'd like to ask, maybe you can prepare them now. But Aura, I wanted to, you just said there's only few moments or 2 moments that are diegetic, or there are only certain aspects that you think of as documentary. But I think you also touched on something that the film does, which is that it is an archive of, it is in its very mode of production, in certain moments an archive of a moment in time, a kind of time capsule. And that sequence in Jerusalem is so much the case, or in Bethlehem is so much the case, where, seeing, both in the content of the image, the border wall, and in its mode of production of using a drone to capture that image. Both of those, one is not possible, I imagine, right now, and one signifies really differently today than it did at that time. And I wonder if I know that there's more to say about that image, and I wonder if you'd
a lot
want
to
to
say about that. Each side, so to speak, was filmed by a different crew, and that was a really important consideration for me. The ethics of who has the possibility of movement, who's on which side of the wall. So that's the first thing to say. And the opening shot of the ambulance going by is also keeps reading differently, obviously. The last shot, there was one shot that this journalist who is a photojournalist who operates the drone on the kind of Israel side, works for Haaretz, and shot the very last image. I asked him to shoot it again because the weather conditions were different. So for continuity's sake, to shoot, it's actually a settlement that overlooks Ramallah. And that was shot on the 6th of October, 2023. And he had some people in that neighborhood called the police on him, and because he had Haaretz press card, he was fine. But I spoke to him shortly after to check in, and he was like, we're not going to be able to film anything with drones again in Israel, and I imagine in the West Bank even less so. So that has been very hard. Watching it is very hard. One thing I will say is, obviously, yes, it is an archive, and some of the sites that feature in the film, like the coal-fired power station on the verge of demolition, has been demolished. The section in Chile, we were trying to film it, and actually also in Aotearoa in New Zealand, we had the same issue. There were floods. We had to delay the shoot. The section in Chile, the volcano was too active. It wasn't safe to go and film. So we had all of these kind of live emergencies that were kind of impacting the process of the film, but then since then also impacted. So even the section of the oil refinery in Scotland, Grangemouth, that has since been, it's not decommissioned, but it's going to, just another freak example, but we shot in Lapland on the 4th of March, I think it was 2022. But anyway, the point where I mentioned the nuclear fallout from neighboring countries, that was Chernobyl, where nuclear fallout appeared in, I think, reindeer meat through the moss. But actually, that was when one of the nuclear power plants in the war, Russia against Ukraine, I can't remember exactly the detail, but all this to say that lots of things were live and are live and changing, and some of these things are no more, and others will be more devastating, and others, I hope, will survive this. I don't know what else to say, really, but it's also very powerful to rewatch some of these things when certain elements are very, very present in our minds. And for me, just my process of watching this again and again. I don't always sit in and watch it, but today I did. But it keeps evolving, and some bits are harder than others.
Hello, audience. What's in your minds anyone wants to say anything. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for this film. It's incredibly affecting, and hearing you both speak about it is really deepening the experience of it. So thank you both. I'm curious if you could tell us some about your conversations with musicians, what prompt you gave them. I'm curious if you said more or less, and I'm imagining it probably went differently with different musicians. So if you could tell us some about those exchanges, and then also how their proposals, their sound proposals, got you thinking differently about sirens.
Definitely. I mean, as I said, I couldn't have done this film alone. And I am, by nature, my process is very dialogic. I need to be in conversation to find my way through the atmosphere I have more or less identified. Laurie Spiegel very early on. So Laurie features twice. A few musicians feature more than once, and some of them, actually, I gave them this prompt, which is the opening text that you read, which is a mixture of things that I said, but this definition of the siren, and that was a kind of score, instructional score. And some people came up with more than one option, and they just really, like Evelyn Glennie, I think, gave me 10 different tracks, and Ilpo Vasainen the same, and others like Mazen. I said the minimum was 90 seconds, and it could be long. So actually, because some of these were done as short film commissions, like Sarah Davachi did a 20-minute piece. Her pieces are long, usually, and then it was kind of excerpted here. But Laurie, when I first reached out to her in 2017, she was like, well, the first thing that comes to mind is my piece, Kepler's Harmony of the World, which was the famous piece that was sent on the golden record to NASA, and it is the sonification of the sound of the planets, so kind of data sonification, but very early on. And she said, you can have the stems, like each planet, and mix it as remix it as you wish. And I think of it as a siren almost of the world, and its indifference to us as tiny little specks on planet Earth. But then she said, but I really want to make a piece about animal extinction. She's an animal activist. She feeds the pigeons multiple times a day and thinks about it all the time. And that took maybe another year and a half or two. So I think when I had another little bit of money, or maybe she was thinking about it, but it was slow. Oh yeah, because she wanted to work with the manatees and a particular species called Sirenia, which was kind of wordplay as well. But she couldn't find recordings of them. And anyway, but that really made me think about how to bring in animal sounds into it. I mean, she did that by bringing field recordings, and other people, FUJITA, the musicians, did that as well. But sometimes the sound kind of took me somewhere, like Elaine Mitchener's voice, which is the water chamber. It was also one of the first ones, and I just spent so much time with it, and I just had this image of both the mythological sirens, but also thinking of the refugee crisis and someone just far, far away, and we can hear their little whistle calling, and it just, like, the sound just took me to this notion of like someone far away at sea trying to reach the shore. And so sometimes that's what happened. And then when I came across the storm chamber, I was like, okay, this is an interesting fit. With every musician it was different, and also this is like a 7-year research process, weaving many, many conversations together. And as I said, some musicians, those conversations had happened earlier and then later and then again. And some, by the end of the film, there were some pre-existing pieces of music with people like Mazen I'd worked with for the 2017 iteration. But then when I shot the Palestine-Israel section, I was thinking of this piece, Walls Will Fall, which he did in 2018, I think, or 19. So a little bit after, but kind of we were thinking in parallel. And actually, he did one, like what I did with Raven here, we did a work in progress screening. I think we did 2, actually. And we were like, when I heard that piece of his and he gifted it to me, I was like, oh my God, we have to do something together around this. And then when I was about to film that section, I was like, this sound is just, it's all of it. And if you've ever heard the Holocaust siren, it's also this like tone, but then it's also these voices. It had so many layers. And so the production company I worked with in Palestine, I said, I'm thinking of using something like this. So they used that sound while they filmed as a kind of sonic score to their filming. And then I asked Mazen if he had something else or if he wanted to do something else. And that was with 49 musicians in a water reservoir in Berlin. So the acoustics were very particular, and it's a binaural recording. Anyway, to cut a long story short, in agreement with him, we decided to excerpt a bit of a pre-existing piece. So some people it was like that, but the conversation was still there. Like, could this work as a siren, or as a commemorative siren, or as a summoning, or a heralding? Yeah, it was very varied.
I think we have time to hear from others. Yes, at the back.
The ones in the darkness.
Hi. I will echo the last person and say that the conversation has been deepening of the film. So thank you for that. I just wondered if you, and maybe the indigenous section touched on this a little bit, if you consciously or literally wanted to call into the animal howl, or like the emotive wailing of people, like especially thinking about the voiceless or the disembodied, or the voice as agency, and the, you know, the hopeful kind of embrace of what this could project into the future. So just if there's any did you try to emit that, or do you want it to be more human-centered?
I mean, as I said, I was so grateful to the people I spoke to for kind of conjuring some of these other alternatives. So what Matariki says so beautifully is that sirens, you know, they're part of, well, the first thing she says that is really powerful, that it's a colonial imposition. Like, that in itself says a lot. But also that they are there to protect human life and human property. And that a different kind of siren would be thinking also of the polluted rivers, or of the species that are being exterminated. And this kind of weaving of us into our environments, with our environments, is a really important message of the film, I think. But also something that she says towards the end, that we've internalized it. And I think in all this period of thinking around sirens, like, there are these animal sounds, like the piece that Laurie did, which is the Lapland siren. There's just so much grief in that howl. It's just, and we don't necessarily understand it, you know, like whale song. Like, maybe we are projecting all this stuff onto it and it doesn't mean what we think it means. But there's a sense in which there's a variety of registers in sirens, and actually I was looking at the different like names of different types of sirens, and they are the I think it's piercer, howler, rumbler, you know, different sirens that seem to do something slightly different on a kind of, yeah. And even just thinking of like the sound that is the wail of grief, or the screechy sound that is to ward something off or to avoid something happening, like that sound that is an animal sound, that is a human non-verbal vocalization in the cry, or in the screech, or in the, you know, all of these different registers, or the moan, you know, they all have something that is siren-like, but they touch different parts of our body, parts of our emotion. So yeah, it was very much, I was thinking a lot about animal sounds, and like, I think there's a theory that the siren is in part kind of echoing wolves, howling at each other across distances. But it's a signal, like Daphne Carr talks so beautifully about these sounds that are like herding devices, that are like to move people in space, across space, or keep them contained within a certain area, etc.
All right, I want to ask you. Oh, yeah, please. Yeah. I think this might be our last question from the audience.
Thank you so much for, I want to like echo what you both shared. The conversation really like helped me, like grounded me further. And I also feel like you've answered questions that I've had. So like, I don't know if this is going to be a question, but I'm not sure how to ask this, but I'm thinking of surveillance and like sonic violence a lot, and almost like kind of like an invert relationship, in the sense of like with surveillance there is like a silence, and there is also like a looking into, like being invited where not welcomed, or not invited, just kind of like imposing. And then with sonic violence, there is almost like this outward, like constant, like presence that is also like. So I'm thinking about that, and then I'm also thinking about attention economy, which you've addressed through your conversation. But I'm also thinking about it of like, and like, bear with me. Like for example, notifications, right? Like as a sign, or like an alarm in some way. But it's also like this kind of like trap that keeps us doing something that, even though it's exhausting and like there's a fatigue with it, like it keeps happening. And with, I don't know what I'm trying to ask, but I'm like trying to think of like, have you thought about like that relationship, like where there's this kind of like the attention is pulled in and kind of continuous, versus I'm hearing from like sonic violence, there's like the attention, like the fatigue is like, I'm hearing it and I'm not going to engage with it.
Yeah, definitely. There is actually, so most sirens nowadays are supplemented by text alerts. And I spoke to some emergency app developers who work for the Red Cross and a bunch of different organizations, and they have a similar problem around the attention economy, because people have notifications on all the time and it's exhausting. And if you choose to put it on silent or put it in another room, then it's like not hearing the siren. Like, it's just that they have the same problem of reaching people. But equally, I was thinking a lot about vibratory alerts, and most people I know have their phone on silent. I do. So like when you mentioned the haptic listening, like that was really on my mind. And Evelyn Glennie, the percussionist who features with the Thunderbolt siren and then with the volcano, and then at the very end, she's an incredible deaf percussionist. So she feels through touch, through the soles of her feet, through vibration, but also through sight and smell and other senses. And I was really thinking that it's not that hard to recompose the siren. It's happened with our phones. And those of us that are old enough that had like old landlines, you know, you heard it, and then you got a phone, and initially everyone had like quirky little sounds. And then now we just feel it vibrate, and we're very attuned to that. You can hear a small sound. An alarm doesn't have to be alarming. But we are in a world where, you know, Arturo says very beautifully this notion of design, and it's much more than design, but actually there is a soundscape and an attention problem in terms of the design of the world right now, because it is overstimulating, overwhelming, and kind of numbing. And that is the kind of ontological crisis around what you said with evidence as well. It's like it's hard to take it in and process and like respond and do something to it. And I think, it's again, I'm talking kind of metaphorically and also literally, because very physically our phone is just constantly like blurting at us and calling upon us to do something, even if it's whatever, answer that email or so it is a wider problem. The siren is a kind of epitome of this wider problem around the attention economy, the attention ecology, and the ethics of that, like what that means. So, and what I was going to say about Evelyn's notion, like she's listening seismically, like that's how people listen to volcanoes, through vibration, and she's very literally doing that. But in the moment where we mentioned, so when she composed those percussion pieces and sent them to me, she envisioned them being transformed into mobile phone vibratory patterns. So that's how she understood them, as music, because they're patterns, but because we were thinking of textual alerts. So there is one little vibratory sound in the film, but I don't know if it worked, because you'd have to have it on you to feel it.
I'm really happy that first of all, these are all kind of wonderful questions from the audience, and I just want to acknowledge that. And your point about the phone actually made me think about something else, which is that the voices of AI assistants are often feminized or feminine voices because people feel more comfortable yelling at them. And this is actually true. So there's a kind of encoded misogyny in the very kind of logic of our own kind of call and response relationship with these devices. And I actually wanted to dwell on that a little bit as one final question to you, or a reflection, rather. You can pick it up or not, which is about your own voice and having a kind of feminine voice in the film that is also an accented, slippery voice. And I want to think about that in relation to something you said about the siren, which has got my noodle moving now, which is that the siren is a sound that protects human property. And one of the received ideas that we have about a voiceover in a film is that it should be unaccented, and it should be devoid of all of these little body sounds that actually make a voice, that actually introduce the body into a voice. And so the human property has often been fed to us as actually something disembodied. And so I really appreciated the way that your body re-enters the vocal space in this film in a way that is also gently pushing that away.
It was very hard to decide. I think when I did some initial experiments, I just had the text, and it was hard to like come into voice, so to speak, to be like, okay, I'm gonna speak this. And because I loved Khalid's voice so much, and because he's an actor, I asked him to read it back to me, and he heard my voice, but then kind of responded with his, and he was like, it has to be you. And I think ethically it had to be me as well, because of these people that are speaking, that are so kind of close up and intimate and vulnerable. But we had a very special connection. So my voice being there is like coherent and consistent with the fact that we were in conversation and we were prompting each other to think in certain ways. But one of the reasons I didn't want it to be my voice is because I have a slippery accent from many different countries and different languages, but I also didn't want this authorial voice of like the David Attenborough equivalent, like that kind of like very authoritative, very British, very middle class. That was problematic as well. And I guess with me, like maybe I sound probably like the closest thing would be maybe British middle class, but also like a bit of Australian. People don't necessarily know, and I overemphasize some words, and even a couple of words I mispronounced, and then like talking with someone who speaks English different. I mean, this is my mother tongue, but like I think the word compass, I think I said I don't remember how I said it, but I had like another way of saying it, and it was like, no, this in Britain, this is how we say it, and I was like, okay. So the accent was a thing, but then when I was looking for another voice, what I wanted was someone who had a slippery accent that you couldn't place. And I was like, well, I have that. It's just I'm cringing because it's me. But also, I also thought, okay, do I want this voice that's thinking out loud, like some of they are doing, you know, like that they're very close to the surface of thought, if that makes sense, rather than the scripted, rehearsed way of speaking. And I was like, well, my voice has a different role. My voice is guiding and weaving your sight and sounds the way you... So I tried to be as minimal as possible, and I tried to speak with the rhythm of the footage and the sounds so that the voice wouldn't interfere too much with the other experience. But it had to be like a score that directs your attention. And so in that sense, the voice... It's not flat, because I think it is a little bit, I think I'm a bit emotional in it, but I tried to be just like a, you know, like a guide that is just telling you to like listen in a certain way that's not, I didn't want to impose, if that makes sense. And someone I spoke to when I was like, oh, I can't figure out the tone. And they were like, well, what about the air, what's it called? Person in the airplane. I don't know what the word is, air hostess, but that's gendered. I don't know. Anyway. The person on the plane who's like telling you what to do in case of emergency, like, is this very reassuring? Like there might be an emergency, most likely not, but if there is, do this. I was like, so that wasn't exactly the idea I was thinking of, but something that like, flight attendant, that's it, yeah. Like, just in a wider sense, like for me, this film has been like a handrail or like a thing, like a beacon, something to hold on to. And I thought of my voice maybe as doing that a little bit for the audience as well. It's like this steady thing that hopefully just like carries you through it when it gets a bit dizzying, which I know it does at some point.
Thank you, Aura.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you everyone.